Good morning and welcome to the Creatus webinar on community-led and council-led energy. Just going to give a brief introduction to our theme and then introduce our guests today. So when it comes to achieving net zero, we've all got our parts to play, as we know. While we can all do our bit individually, at Creatus, we're great believers that local government hold the key to achieving net zero by 2050. From either reducing consumption in our own homes or ensuring the nation has enough carbon-friendly power, our local authorities cover every home and business, and they can use their influence, policies and access to funding to transform the sector and help us reach net zero. For those of you that don't know Creatus, we were built on local government, founded by a councillor, and many of our team, including myself, have served or still serve as elected members or senior leaders or officers in local authority. And we use this experience in our work with public affairs, community engagement, planning consultancy and our advisory services. Earlier this year, Creatus launched our Decarbonising Energy series of webinars to focus on microgeneration and retrofitting. This session takes a slightly broader view and concentrates on those councils who've really taken the bull by the horns and invested in their own renewable projects, and at community organisations who are enabling residents to invest in projects and communities to generate their own power. We're also going to have a look at the role of local plans in ensuring that, as well as low energy homes, councils are considering how they generate local energy. Cambridgeshire, Swindon and Bristol councils have led the way in solar, wind and even hydrogen schemes. And we've also got panellists from Ripple Energy, Community Energy South and the Centre for Sustainable Energy. So I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves briefly and your role and what you're doing in the field of renewable energy at the moment, to give us a context, and then we'll have a discussion around some of the issues that you faced, opportunities that you have going forward, and perhaps some tips for councils and communities who want to follow what you have been doing. So can I start with Councillor Lorna Dupre from Cambridgeshire? Hi, Lorna.
Good morning. I'm Councillor Lorna Dupre and I am the chair of Cambridgeshire County Council's Environment and Green Investment Committee, and I've been in that post for 2 months and 1 day. So by way of introduction, and I know we've been asked to keep our initial remarks short and to the point, I'll introduce you briefly to some of Cambridgeshire County Council's projects developed by our excellent climate change and energy services team. Our 12 megawatt solar park at Triangle Farm in Soham has been generating clean energy since 2017. It currently delivers the council a minimum of £350,000 net income each year to support council services. Following on from this, in December 2020, we've approved the construction of North Angle Solar Farm on a 188-acre site south of the existing Triangle Farm. This will be a 30 megawatt solar farm, which could generate nearly the same amount of electricity as used by 12,000 households annually. The scheme will be built under an energy performance contract with our project designer, Bouygues Energy, and is expected to deliver a further £300,000 a year to the council. We're also using our park and ride sites around Cambridge for the purposes of energy generation. At St Ives Park and Ride, our smart energy grid will consist of solar panels installed on canopies over the car parking spaces, with battery storage, electric vehicle charging infrastructure and private wires to customers. The electricity generated on site will serve all the demand for the site itself, and the excess will be sold through private wires to commercial customers nearby. We expect a reduction of 7,691 tonnes of carbon emissions over the 30-year life of the project, and a renewable energy and storage project that supports electrification of transport and supplies clean energy to local businesses. In addition, the learning from the project will be shared with at least 40 local businesses as part of a business support programme to help build knowledge, skills and capacity in the low-carbon environmental goods and services sector. This is a project that's been 5 years in the making so far. The council submitted an outline application for ERDF funding to MHCLG in August 2016, and the project received planning approval in July 2018. At Babraham Road Park and Ride on the other side of Cambridge, phase 1 of the smart energy grid will consist of 5,210 solar modules mounted on solar carports, which will generate electricity equivalent to that used by 740 households and prevent 7,300 tonnes of CO2 emissions over the 30-year lifetime of the project. Like St Ives, it includes electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which will serve up to 80 vehicles and a private wire to supply electricity to a local customer. Over time, we hope to move to a phase 2 of commercialisation to encourage more battery storage. The Park and Ride site can be developed to cater for a wide range of transport services, including e-scooters and electrified light freight. A priority for the Council's decarbonisation agenda in the community is the need to address the around 10,000 oil-dependent homes in the county and help them move on to more sustainable alternatives. In the village of Swaffham Prior in East Cambridgeshire, the community itself came up with the vision of replacing oil with a ground source heat pump scheme to serve the whole village. The council has been able to bring to this not only the expertise of its climate change and energy services team, but also a nearby piece of the council's own farm's estate to provide the land for 180 boreholes and a barn to house the technology. Not only does this project give everyone in the village the opportunity to switch to renewable energy, which will be guaranteed cheaper than their present fuel bills, but it also removes the upfront costs of private provision, which would exclude less affluent households. Other oil-dependent communities in Cambridgeshire are watching this project with interest, and another community project was launched a year ago in the villages of Graffham, Great Staunton and Perry in Huntingdonshire to do the same thing. So in summary, the expertise built up by our in-house officer team has enabled Cambridgeshire County Council to take advantage of a number of opportunities which have been afforded to us by our supply of suitable land and existing facilities, a growing economy in the area around Cambridge looking for clean energy, and some fantastically energised individuals in local communities. It's fair to say that not all of this has been straightforward, and there are challenges ahead, but we now have some terrific in-house knowledge and experience which we can use for environmental, social and financial benefit. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lorna. I think what's really interesting about that is that combination of that sort of urban and rural. I know when we did our scheme, our webinar with Cornwall, one of the biggest issues Cornwall was facing was the vast number of their homes that were so rural that most of the time the options that were being come up with really weren't practical. So I think that Swaffham Prior scheme sounds absolutely fascinating. David Renard is the leader of Swindon Council, which obviously has a similar, I'm assuming, with having a mainly urban area, but with a rural hinterland. Would you like to tell us a little bit about some of the innovation that's been going on in Swindon?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky, and hi, everybody. We are currently 70% rural, but we've got big housing developments on stream, so that will change. But yes, the centre is very urbanised here. So we've been working on this agenda for a number of years, particularly around solar parks, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. But really the background to this starts in January 2020 when the council passed a motion committing us to ensuring that the council's estate activities are net carbon zero by 2030. And we've also signed up to the government commitment around wider emissions than the 2050 target. Subsequently, last May, I appointed, May 2020, I appointed a cabinet member for climate change. And he's really, he lives the whole climate change thing. He's got electric cars, solar panels on his house, and does a range of other things. So he's the perfect person to lead on this agenda for us. And he's really started to pull together various strategies and action plans to support the work that we're doing. So we've got a draft carbon reduction strategy, which was taken to Cabinet in October of last year. And that's been out to public consultation and has been approved by Cabinet in February of this year. We've also got a net zero emissions action plan, which sets out the actions that are both underway and planned that will have a direct impact on reducing our organisation's greenhouse gas emissions. It will includes enabling actions that, once completed, should identify further opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which can either be implemented within existing operations or may be subject to securing new sources of funding. And we're also setting out those planned actions that will support the wider borough on the journey to support residents and organisations across the borough on the journey to achieve that net zero target, which includes links to UK-wide same-date targets set by the government. So examples of things that we've done that will have a direct impact on reducing the council's greenhouse gas emissions. We're currently undertaking an LED streetlight replacement programme, and as of the middle of last month, over half of the borough's streetlights had been replaced with LEDs. We're going to install a 1.2 megawatt battery at our operations depot, and that will store 402,000 kilowatts of excess generation each year from the solar farm that I'll talk about in a moment, and will be used to supply our operations there down at the depot. And this year we're purchasing 15 ultra low emission vehicles as part of the wider replacement of the council's fleet. Earlier this month, we launched something called the Be the Change campaign, which is aimed at residents to showcase the contribution that they and organisations are already making. And so that information is available on the council website. I can post that in the chat later on. We've had good support from the media so far. I'm working with organisers in Bays, the UK-wide Carbon Zero Tour. We're also going to be hosting an event in Swindon in September. As we know, we're not going to achieve net zero without everybody making their contribution. And I think it's an important message that we don't, everybody doesn't assume that it's just the council who has to do all this. We're also monitoring and evaluating the action plan that will go to Cabinet annually to identify the progress that we've been made on reducing our emissions against the baselines that we've already put in place. And there'll also be regular officer meetings overseeing the delivery of the action plan. So a number of years ago, we set up a company called Public Power Solutions, which is a wholly owned company of Swindon Borough Council. And they've been really instrumental in helping us to reduce the council's carbon footprint, and will continue to play a critical role. So some of the things that they've been doing, they've introduced a sustainable waste disposal system, which has reduced CO2 emissions by processing 100% of Swindon's municipal waste, which was previously destined for landfill. And that produces a solid recovered fuel, which can be used as a fuel substitute for industry. We've got a number of large-scale solar farms, the largest of which is 74.5 megawatts of solar power, and that's enough to generate about 18,500 homes a year, equating to CO2 reduction of over 26,000 tonnes per annum. And there are other developments as well across the whole borough. Battery storage, we're looking to develop a 30 megawatts grid connection to batteries installed on a particular piece of land that doesn't have any other use. As I mentioned earlier on, that's going to supply our depot. In terms of biodiversity net gain, we've developed a model for achieving net biodiversity increase on the sites that are owned by PPS. And then funding opportunities. They've been looking at facilitating investment in large-scale renewable energy schemes for local authority and community investors. We launched the first solar green bond at Common Farm Solar Farm, and recently secured £3 million of investment in sustainable energy projects at our Waterside Innovation Hub. That's where our depot is in Swindon. And they're also working on the delivery of a heat plan for the council's key buildings. And also, they don't just work within the borough, they have been working with other local authorities and indeed with government. So, for example, they've been working with the Ministry of Defence, advising them on development of solar for the defence estate, and 2 large-scale projects are now under construction. So that's a quick canter through of some of the things that we've been doing, and I'll leave it there. Back to you, Vicky.
Thank you, David. Thanks ever so much. And welcome to Nicola, who's unfortunately had a few technical issues, but has joined us. Nicola, I'd like to come to you next just to give a brief introduction. Obviously, we've talked a lot about solar, but there is a lot of hot air in the Bristol area, but yours tends to be through wind. So would you like to just give us a little run through about the council's renewable energy, particularly with reference to the fantastic scheme at Avonmouth, and you've also got some interesting things going on with biomass. Oh, we can't hear you, Nicola. Is your sound on? Oh, golly. I tell you what.
Hello.
Yeah, there you go. There we are.
I'd like to caveat this by the fact I've just come back from 2 weeks on leave, and this is my first thing that I've done since coming back. So apologies for the technological issues. Good morning, everyone. And it's really good. Oh no, my dog's now barking. Hang on a second. Vicky, can you come back to me in a second?
We'll come back to you,
sorry.
Nicola.
1 second.
No, don't worry at all. We're going to go on and speak to Dan from the Centre of Sustainable Energy next. Dan obviously comes at it from a very different perspective. So Dan, tell us a little bit about your role in this area.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dan Stone. I'm a chartered town planner, and I work for the Centre for Sustainable Energy. And that's a kind of independent national charity that shares our knowledge and experience to help people change the way they think and act on energy. And so we have technical expertise, but I'd say our USP is working with communities, really. And so the current UK decarbonisation strategy is really dependent on electrifying everything. So vehicles, buildings, heating. So we only actually decarbonise if the electricity itself is fully renewable in the first place. And the Committee on Climate Change has modelled that as a result of all this electrification and obviously decarbonising energy generation, we need to quadruple renewable energy generation from current levels. So the carbon emissions that we've achieved to date are really the low-hanging fruit, and the changes needed from this point on need informed consent in order to be accepted. I mean, bear in mind here that currently the cheapest form of energy generation, onshore wind, has been under an effective moratorium for the last 5 years due to the lack of that informed consent. So if we increase renewable energy generation solely through kind of top-down imposition, we could easily see a further backlash against renewables, despite the high level of public support nationally. So what tends to happen is that nationally there is a high level of support, but this often disappears when planning permission is sought. So the key question as we see it is, how can local plans and authorities and energy providers capture meaningful public consent to allow renewable energy capacity to be quadrupled? Now, there's quite a bit of research on this, the social gap, that's what it's called, why latent support for renewables disappears when planning permission is sought. And there's 3 main factors. The first is that communities feel that decisions are being taken remotely from them, and they're not sufficiently involved in the trade-offs between the different options. Secondly, that people's emotional attachments to their place, their feelings for their local landscape are not really taken into account in policy formulation. And finally, that communities don't really benefit enough from hosting community projects within their communities in the first place. So we've developed a 1.5-day bottom-up community engagement approach that aims to sort of capture all these insights. And that's at the parish level, enabling the public to have informed, detailed and mature discussions on how low carbon energy infrastructure can be developed. And that's in the absence of sort of an imminent planning application. So in the workshops, we basically spend about half a morning talking about landscape, getting participants to draw maps, deciding as a group which are the sacrosanct parts of their landscape, which aren't, what's changed and what's likely to change in the future. And we give them some really objective, trustworthy information on the different forms of renewable energy generation, so they can have informed conversations. And then we really set them the challenge. What proportion of your community energy demand do you think you could meet from renewable energy generation around you? And participants then discuss their favoured options and the trade-offs between them, and they start to form a consensus as a group as to what might be acceptable within their landscapes. And then because we've spent a morning discussing landscape and drawing maps, they can start to actually discuss suitable locations. And the bones of this kind of workshop process, I mean, the outputs of this workshop process are the kind of bones of a renewable energy strategy that you can then consult the wider community with. And we've run this 4 times so far, twice as trials. And so far, our assumptions have been proved correct, really. One, that given good technical information, normal people can be trusted to make sensible, decent choices. Number 2, that the conversation should take place with a focus on the locality as a whole and all of the options and opportunities available without addressing specific proposed developments which might be in play or imminent. Thirdly, that the process should start by exploring what people value about their locality and their lives within it, rather than what their visions are for reducing carbon. And also the framing of the central question is really key. So we found that rather than ask what might be a central political question, what are you going to do about carbon emissions? That tends to elicit a really defensive response. More positive responses are stimulated by framing the question as, how can we best make our contribution to a low carbon future around here? And that embeds a sense of local agency and choices to make. And then fourthly, that really every locality has a duty to make an appropriate contribution to the national targets and system changes. There is no opt-out because there is no somewhere else. And in a recent workshop carried out for a neighbourhood plan development, the community came up with a strategy which, if realised, would generate about 60% of their electricity demand from renewables located within their community, including rooftop solar, solar farms, and commercial scale onshore wind. And we'll now be running this process in 3 local authorities this year, with the outputs being used in planning policy formulation, and with the intention of kind of disseminating this approach more widely. So we think that kind of more nuanced public engagement approaches like this and detailed energy planning is really vital if we're actually to roll out renewables at the scale needed and get the permission from communities to do so. Okay,
that's great, Dan. It sounds to me, I mean, in my council, we're just about to go out to with our draft allocations for our local plan. It sounds to me like we should be doing this around housing as well. You know, to be able to say, okay, we need this. You know, where would you put it? Because at the moment, you go out with a list of places, and everyone goes, not in my backyard, for very understandable reasons, because they've actually presented almost a fait accompli rather than the other way round, which I think would be a welcome thing for all of us in councils. Yeah,
Bath and North East Somerset tried that approach, I think successfully, if you wanted to find out more.
Excellent, fantastic. Nicola, is your dog under control now? Bless.
My dog is under control. I'm so sorry, everyone. Blimey. Bristol's known to be quite disruptive, and I'm just playing into that beautifully this morning. So I'm very sorry. Should I start again, Vicky?
Please do, Nicola. Thank you so much for being with us.
No problem at all. As I say, it's a pleasure to be here. So I think you mentioned in the intro that you wanted to talk about the wind turbine project in Avonmouth in Bristol, but I just wanted to give a little bit of context about Bristol and where our heads are for people that perhaps aren't as familiar with the city or don't know our story in this space really. So obviously you may have seen that Bristol was the first city to declare a climate emergency back in November 2018 when full council voted on that, and that was, I guess that's one of those headlines that people will see and think, oh, that's very Bristol. But the truth is we were doing we were working on renewable energy, and we were making our commitment to the environment really clear even back in 2009 when the Avonmouth wind turbine project was first approved. And so I think it's just it's the next step. It was a big step, but it's the next step in Bristol's sustainability journey rather than it being sort of the headline with nothing that sits beneath it. Since the declaration, we were also, I guess I'm always keen on these seminars to talk about these twin crises between climate and ecology. And so in February last year, 2020, little did we know, just before the pandemic really hit us, we declared an ecological emergency in the city as well. So if we fast forward to May this year, when I was asked to join Marvin's cabinet as the cabinet member for climate, ecology, energy and waste, and really I'm coming into this role tackling those kind of very 4 interconnected but also independently important sort of areas of our city's infrastructure, really. And I think that's the way that as a city we sort of take a view on this. In Avonmouth, so I guess one of my reflections in the last 2 months of coming into this role is that we have a hugely vibrant and really, really important community-led energy sector in Bristol, and they've achieved some really fab things already. And I think that's important to note before we go into the discussion. That, you know, between there's a solar project in Southmead. We've obviously got a huge amount of work happening out in Lawrence Weston, and we've also got our community wind farm project, which I talked about before, in Avonmouth. There's 2 turbines in Avonmouth, and it's, as I say, at the time, long before I was on the council, so I don't have the kind of institutional knowledge of this project really, but you know, it's one of those great community projects which now everyone looks at and thinks, well, why didn't we do that sooner? But actually at the time, it was quite challenging. Looking back through all the sort of stories about it and sort of some of the interesting debates about the role wind turbines would play. You said at the beginning, Vicky, that Bristol is very is good for turbines. It actually isn't at all. It's the only windy part of our city is Avonmouth, which in itself now, if you fast forward to 2021, people would snap our hands off for wind turbines, I think, in the city, you know, as a really strong renewable energy source, but we're not windy enough. So there is only one small section of our city which can sustain wind turbines. And so it's we're really proud of the turbines we do have there. And obviously, as I said a second ago, there is an amazing community-led group called Ambition Lawrence Weston, who have also now and actually led to a change in policy in our local plan in 2018, which really suggests the power of community action. They are well underway with their turbine project in Lawrence Weston, but actually we need to look at a much more sophisticated or different mix of renewable energy sources in order to respond to our climate emergency. So I don't mind talking about some of that now, Vicky, or do you want to go into the questions?
I think if we'll come back to that, if that's okay, Nicola, and feel free to pipe in. While we're talking wind, I'm going to bring Sarah in, because Sarah's giving us all the opportunity to own our own wind turbine if we don't live in a windy part of the country. So Sarah, tell us a bit about the brilliant story of Ripple. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, so Ripple is a completely new type of company in the sector. So what we do is we enable people and businesses as well to own a micro share of a large scale wind farm, and then get the green electricity that it generates supplied to their homes via the grid by our utility partners. So we don't develop projects, and we're not an electricity supplier either. We sit in the middle, and because, you know, with energy, scale is really, really important in terms of bringing down costs. So a big wind farm is just so much cheaper than a small one. But, you know, and individually, you know, if I want to own, at the moment, before Ripple came along, you know, if I wanted to own my own source of green power, my only option was to put solar on my home, which is really expensive, and as it is, my roof isn't suitable for it. So it just sort of excludes me from being able to own my own source of power. So what Ripple does is we enable everyone to do it. So it doesn't matter where you live, whether you rent, and like for businesses as well, it's quite important, because if they lease their properties, they can't necessarily put solar on the roof. If people rent their homes, they can't put solar on the roof. If you live in a flat, you can't do solar. So it's about enabling everyone, no matter where you live or what type of property you live in. Everyone can own their own tiny part of a large scale wind farm. So we have just we launched our first project, which is a 2.5 megawatt wind farm in South Wales that started construction a couple of weeks ago, and it's going to be generating green electricity for the 850 owners of the wind farm by Christmas. So we were also that project also benefited from a grant from the Welsh Government, and the Welsh Government have been absolutely amazing. We are about to launch a much bigger project later on in the year, and so this will have multiple suppliers that we'll be working with, so you can choose, you know, which of our suppliers you want to be supplied by. They then buy the electricity from the wind, they buy your electricity from your wind farm and supply it to your home via the grid. So very roughly, you know, instead of having to pay £4,500, £6,000, £7,000 for rooftop solar, for our first project it's around £1,800 for a typical householder. For our next project, we're expecting it to be slightly cheaper than that. And then you save, because you own a bit of a wind farm and you are supplied with your green electricity from your wind farm to your home, you can save around sort of 25% off your electricity bill over the wind farm's 25-year lifetime. So it's just a really easy way for people to act on climate change. there's obviously a lot of green tariffs around in the market, and I think people, you know, they don't necessarily all deliver the sort of impact that people, you know, maybe think they do. But with Ripple, you get all the convenience of a green tariff. You don't have anything on your home. There's no scaffolding going up. There's no, you know, you can do it anywhere. But you get the real impact of actually directly owning a bit of a wind farm. You make these wind farms happen by directly funding them yourself, and then obviously you get the benefits of the green electricity that they generate. So yeah, so it's it just enables consumers, instead of just sitting there paying whatever electricity bill ends up on their doorstep, they get to be part of the whole value chain right the way up to the top. We don't think that, you know, just big pension funds, big utilities need to own projects. We think that everyone can do it. We also have an MOU with an offshore wind farm. So this isn't about, you know, traditionally community energy or sort of community owned energy have been very small scale projects. We think consumers should be able to have access to the very best projects. So, you know, very large offshore wind farms, they're not going to own the whole thing. But, you know, if a group of, it's all done via a co-op. So if a Ripple managed co-op can own 10% of an offshore wind farm, that's really, really fantastic. So yeah, so it's about giving people access to the very best projects, and that means, yeah, tends to mean large scale projects, because they are the lowest cost ones. And yeah, and you don't need to be a wind energy expert, because we are the experts for you, basically. So it's just, we just make it all really, really simple for people. So yeah, it's I could go on a lot more about Ripple, but yeah.
Well, we're going to come back to it, Sarah, because I've got a couple of questions for you about it. I just want to bring our final guest, Ollie, in. And Ollie has taken that sort of community-led approach completely differently. It's sort of, you know, getting the community to map out their future. Tell us a bit about that your organisations, Ollie, and where you sit in this whole community-led energy framework.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, Vicky, and thanks for inviting us along. And Sarah is a product of the community energy sector, and, you know, working with Unity and Co-op Community Energy. It's a great innovation. So yeah, I'm Ollie Pendred. I'm the Chief Exec of Community Energy South. We're a network of community energy groups in the southeast of England. And we do three things. We help community energy in the southeast with capacity building, with new innovation, and we act as the voice for the sector in the southeast, like CSE do in the west of the country. I'm also a director of Community Energy England. There are now 6,000 community energy projects in the UK. And our State of the Sector report recently that we did in preparation for COP this year outlines that by 2030, that could multiply by 10 or 20 times, between 10 or 20 times. So that's 120,000 projects. And the whole point of community energy is bringing community finance in and giving control to communities. So we, you know, with local authority friends here from Swindon, Cambridge and Bristol, who you know about community energy in your area, but basically where you have local area energy plans and strategies, we are trying to do a bottom-up approach where we create networks of community energy companies that become advocates for what the local authorities are doing, but also can provide community finance. So we do that in three ways, and I'll just outline those briefly. So our Pathways programme is a mentoring programme, which we're developing in Essex, Hampshire, and across Southdowns National Park, and soon to be Surrey. We went to Essex to begin with because there were no community energy groups in Essex. But the leader of the council there has really taken climate emergency, you know, the bull by the horns, and they have a very strong climate strategy. And that's their number one priority. And they wanted to create that network of communities that are doing it for themselves in place. So we've now mentored 10 new community energy groups across Essex. And we work closely with the climate change team to enable them to get up and running and have their own energy plans for their own communities, but also become advocates for the council's energy strategy. So that's a really important point to make. And in doing that, so that we have 42 current operating community energy groups in the southeast of England, like a donut around London. London also has about 40 community energy groups. But around the southeast, we have 42 community energy groups, and we have 15 new community energy groups coming through our training program pathways. So, you know, it's expanding very quickly. And because of climate emergency, we're finding, you know, the phone's ringing all the time with new community energy groups. So that's great. Now, to support with new business models, you know, in line with Swaffham, we developed something called Communiheat. So we've got a very engaged rural community of 700 homes that have been having energy cafes and really engaged in energy for 10 years. And 80% of the village has oil for heating, which is a massive, it's about 30% of the carbon footprint for that village. So what we're doing, we're working with UK Power Networks, the electricity network operator, and with Energy Agency Borough Happold, to give a planned approach to that whole village going to net zero. So that up to 2030. So that means what's coming out of it is that every household has an energy plan, and they have a plan when they want to go to renewables or when they would like to go to renewables. And our sort of mission behind that, building the framework, is to get the supply chain ready, to make sure all the installers are able to be ready to roll out to one target community, air source heat pumps, solar, you know, retrofit and everything. And this is enabled to pay market. So it sits alongside local authority housing. And secondly, we're looking at finance solutions. So obviously community municipal bonds, but ideally people need low cost finance to retrofit, you know, to really crack this. And the benefit of that will be creating skills and jobs for the supply chain. So Communiheat is a really exciting project, and it's expanding, and we're clustering it out. And then next, I'll just explain Riding Sunbeams. So we've also founded Riding Sunbeams, where we targeted Network Rail, the country's largest energy user. And we said to them, why aren't you powering your railways with direct wire renewable energy? And because we're community led, we got to open doors very high up in Network Rail. And over 5 years, we've built the model to power the railways with renewable energy. And we're just in the process of building the first 5 megawatt solar farm to actually directly power the railways. And that will end up being refinanced as a community-owned scheme, because we want community to own these schemes alongside local authorities as well. But we want people to understand that they can empower themselves to you know, to understand climate change and net zero. And that's exportable across the country. So it's very exciting. And that's a little bit about us from the community side and harnessing community wealth.
Thank you, Ollie. That Riding Sunbeams thing, it's crazy really, isn't it, that someone like Network Rail weren't using renewables when it's, you know, it's the rest of us have all been talking about it for a long time. David, I want to come back to the councils, because I know Lorna and Nicola are, you know, both fairly new in their roles, but you've been leader of Swindon Council for a long time, and so I'm sure you were heavily involved in the development of all of these projects. And we were hearing about how you set up a subsidiary company to build those developments. Is that the advice you'd give to other councils to set that up, or what other advice would you give to councils who might be looking to build their projects?
Well, I'd advise other councils to have a look at that model, but I think ultimately they've got to come to their own conclusions. Certainly, it's been hugely successful for us. As I said in my introduction, we've got pretty much so many solar farms that we generate enough electricity that's the equivalent of powering most of the homes in the borough. You know, it's worked for us, and as I said, PPS are also working with other authorities, so clearly there is an interest out there from other authorities as well as government. You know, by all means, talk to PPS. I know the solar expert is one of the attendees listening to this at the moment. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested.
And you started your journey in Swindon with solar PV on the building, so many years ago. Was the solar parks just the next step, or was that quite innovative at the time? Well,
not so much buildings actually, because we've got to the south of the borough something called the Wroughton Airfield, which was part of our Second World War effort, but it's not been used as an airfield for many years and is now part of the Science Museum Group. So they have a huge expanse there, and we talked to them about putting that on. I believe it's still probably the largest solar farm in the country, because they had so much land there, and obviously as a science organisation they were really keen to work with us. But we have and we also set up a community interest company, so the local community there wasn't really any resistance to doing it, because they're getting a direct financial benefit and they can invest in their local community. But there are others that we've done through PPS since then, and they're proving very popular. But of course, initially the government put a lot of incentives into encouraging local authorities and others to set up solar panels and solar parks. Those incentives aren't so great now, but the costs of the units themselves has come down, so you know, it's still something worth doing.
It's interesting that you pretty much proved Dan's point about the fact that if the local community directly benefit from it, then actually a lot of that resistance disappears, doesn't it? Which is, you know, which is obvious when you think about it, and it makes you wonder why more people don't, you know, use that model. Lorna, this Park and Ride initiative, I mean, everything I've read and seen about it is absolutely inspired, but it's so blindingly obvious when you think about it now. You mentioned that there's 40 local businesses you're sharing knowledge with. So is the plan then for supermarkets and major businesses to do the same on their car parks? Is that the plan for the next step?
I think that's a challenge, frankly, thinking about supermarkets and so on. I mean, we're finding that the terrible twins of Brexit and COVID have really made some of these business cases far more challenging for us, and are making the net present value far more, it's reducing, and making that very, very difficult for us to grapple with. So I'm not quite sure how that plays out in a more commercial sector, but there are still huge advantages to doing it, I think, over the long term. But it is challenging at the moment, given the problems that we've got with costs of materials escalating, delays to projects and so on, and that loads a whole lot more risk onto us as a local authority, because of the whole changes in the economy resulting from Brexit and COVID at the moment is making that quite difficult.
That's a really good point.
But just to talk about the park and rides at the moment, I mean, obviously that's something, we've got more park and rides, not just St Ives and Babraham, so we'll be wanting to extend what we do. We are in Cambridge, we're in a combined authority area. We have one of these metro mayors, we're the only rural area in the country to have a metro mayor. So the combined authority is the transport authority. We own the park and rides, but they're responsible for public transport. So they have put in for funding under the zebra scheme for zero emission buses, and we're very much hoping that there will be zero emission buses starting to run, particularly in the urban areas where it's easier for them to do so, starting from next year. And we're looking at putting pantographs, we're intending to put pantographs in those park and ride sites, so that the buses will charge up at Stagecoach's depot overnight, but then can recharge through the pantographs on our park and ride sites. So that will facilitate recharging and the use of more clean buses across our area.
So David and Nicola, park and ride canopies are something you might be able to look at, because Swindon, I think, has got park and ride, hasn't it?
Well, many years ago we set up 2 park and rides, but they weren't really in the best locations, so they weren't awfully well used. So So we've done other things with them over the years. So we don't have any at the moment, but we are looking at doing another one near junction 16 of the M4 if we can pull that off. And I'm sure any development would have to include solar panels as part of that. But no, nothing on that front at the moment here.
And Nicola, have you anything similar planned for Bristol? Because it just seems so obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think one of the interesting parts of this whole area of the council's operation is there is a lot to go at. I think the basic principle for us and our priority at the moment is, and it's a kind of cliche really, but it's bringing people as close to the sources in which energy is generated as possible. And so in Bristol, we've got 24,000 council homes. And one of the big projects that we're embarking on is the provision of solar on the rooftops of those homes and building, you know, in the absence of the tariffs and what David was talking about before, there is still a credible business case, particularly where our interest is in achieving the triple win, as we'd call it. So, you know, we obviously want to get that environmental impact, but fundamentally we want to protect our tenants. And so, you know, there's two real upsides to a project like that for us in Bristol. One is obviously halving people's bills. It kind of goes without saying in terms of utilising the rooftops of our tenants, but also protecting them from the increases in surcharges that is placed on people's energy bills, which are completely regressive, if I'm going to be brutally honest, and aren't necessarily related to people's energy use or the types of homes they live in. And so, you know, pulling people away from the risk of that increased surcharge is something that we're really interested in as well. So a big priority for us in the solar space is utilising our own stock. And that does link to our own commitment to be net zero by 2025 as a council. And so we're well on our way with that, with a 40% reduction from which we were able to report on last year.
You're one of the only councils, aren't you, that's gone for 25 rather than 2030? It might be
yeah, on our own estate, that's correct.
Yeah,
so
yeah, it's fantastic. So this sort of community approach, I think it's really, I mean, Nicola, I'm assuming your tenants, certainly like our tenants, are probably delighted at the idea of having solar on their roofs, you know, so I don't suppose there was much pushback in terms of them not wanting to have their houses with solar panels, because there's a direct benefit to them from doing so.
Yeah, I think you just got to be a little bit careful though, because tenants are not just one person, and so, you know, we're a diverse community and we're a diverse city, and 24,000 people, you know, is a diverse bunch of people. And so I think that there's definitely a tangible benefit to people, and particularly in the challenges around fuel poverty and energy security, I think that makes absolute sense. But like I'm sure all councils on this call, you know, that managing our council stock is not straightforward. You know, that in this debate today, you could make the assumption that all our housing stock is absolutely, you know, pitch perfect, which it's not. So there's also the rolling programme of upgrades and repairs and modifications and all that kind of stuff that fits into that mix. And I think it's always important. It's one of my biggest reflections of being on the local authority, is that there isn't one single lens to look at this through. It is a rolling programme as properties upgraded or new council housing is built, also kind of making sure that we do it in the right way environmentally. And so there will be a standalone project of retrofit, but it is from a tenant's perspective, it's in a much broader mix of council tax, you know, council rent rises potentially. How does that fit with their increased utilities bills at the moment? You know, are they as an example, for a lot of our council tenants actually their children have moved out, so there's challenges around the fact that their house, on paper at least, is too big for them, and so they're looking for somewhere to downsize to in their community. And so when you start to go into the world of council housing and tenant mix, it's unfortunately not quite as straightforward as everyone throwing their hands up in the air with joy about the idea of having PV on their roof. But overall, Vicky, I think it is a super positive thing, and I just think it's a fantastic opportunity to secure that triple win.
Back to the sort of community end, Ollie, the whole business of what you've done with places like, is it Barkham, isn't it, where that you've looked at the village have taken this journey and said, we're going to be net zero. How are we going to do it? It's a very different approach than the sort of council coming along, declaring a climate emergency and then saying, right, now we've got to figure out, you know, how do we get there? What drove the programme in the first place? Was it communities sort of coming to someone like you who happened to have that knowledge? Or did you go into those communities and say, where did that drive come from? And how, you said you've got about 62 or something communities. Is this easily replicable through the neighbourhood plan process in every community?
It could be. Neighbourhood plans are complicated, aren't they? We all know that.
And expensive.
Yeah, and time consuming. It's the target community that we're working with had two benefits. One was that in their local plan in 2009, they earmarked oil as their biggest concern. And at that time, oil was very expensive. It goes up and down over the years, but they wanted to come off oil for heating. Second one was Avesco, which is the local community energy company that came out of Transition Town Lewis, was one of the first community energy companies. So they were able to support and provide a trusted service alongside the council. Now, so that now what's happening is that communities are coming out and going, we want to do something for climate change and net zero, and are coming forward. So that's always going to be food, transport, nature and energy. And sometimes we have communities that really come forward with energy, and we pick them up. And our job is to pick them up and support them to go forward. Now, just on what Nicola said, with local authority housing, we helped with my organisation, Lewis and Eastbourne and Brighton put solar panels on their local authority homes. That's great, and then tenants move. But what needs to happen with local authorities, which doesn't always happen, and I'm not saying this doesn't happen in Bristol, but what happens is that sometimes the tenants aren't educated on how to use the solar. So the able to pay market, they go, right, they make a real conscious decision, we're going to go net zero or have solar. And then they work with that, they work with their scheme. Whereas I feel that local authority tenants need a bit of handholding and education, just how to use their systems properly and to the maximum benefit. And that's really important going forward. And also you've got to consider that not every house can have solar. So then they have a benefit in one, but on the other side of the street, they're still paying the same, high tariffs. So there's something called the electricity bill that's in government at the moment. A lot of authorities are supporting the electricity bill, and a little bit as what Sarah's doing at Ripple is trying to get the cost of electricity down. So gas bills pay no carbon tax, electricity bills pay a carbon tax. Why? Most of electricity in the country is renewables. So we need to lobby governments, if we're going to go electric, to drop the price of electricity as well. As well as finding methods for reducing it, we need electricity prices to go down. So yeah, there's a few things.
There's something every single person watch. I've just written that down because it's interesting what you said about the ability to pay. We have solar panels in our house, and we're very clear about when our washing goes on and when things get switched on. And we heard that in the previous webinar we did about retrofitting, that one of the problems that housing associations have identified is that the way ground source heat pumps and the way they need to operate, some of the tenants aren't given the right information, or when there's a throughput of tenants, they're not given enough information about how to make best use of it, and they end up it costing them more, which is really disappointing.
Yeah, and they're an asset, to the local authority, and actually local authorities can see that their solar portfolios are making them an income. That's really good, so that they're confident to invest in future renewables. But that actual usage at a ground level is really important. So yeah. And
so I love the advice you just gave us, or to speak to our councils about this electricity bill going through. I think everybody can go and lobby their council. But what other advice, Dan and Ollie? So we've only got a few minutes left. What advice would you give to people wanting to set something up in their community? And perhaps their council isn't so forward thinking. Not every council's declared a climate emergency. not every council has the capacity in their officer base, you know, that these great councils have. What advice would you give a community or a resident who wants to make a change? Just very briefly, what's the first thing they should do?
Well, with energy, if they want, search out, go to the Community Energy England's website, find their local community energy group. It may be the nearest one, and talk to them and find out what they're doing. And, you know, and just, yeah, make a plan for your community. A little bit what Dan said is, you know, think about how your community works and what your carbon output for your community is, your overall energy usage. And yeah, so go to the Community Energy England website and just talk to a community group, energy group.
And then I think I'll just follow that up with sort of for community energy groups. I'm sure that most of them know this anyway, but just to kind of make it relevant and interesting to people who perhaps don't even believe in climate change or have some ideological issue about it. Sort of, you know, it's not all about carbon emissions and climate. You know, it's also about kind of, yes, energy bills and comfort at home and community empowerment and, you know, all of those kind of issues, all the co-benefits of doing this work, basically, not just carbon emissions.
So Sarah, that's a really good point to bring you in. And first of all, congratulations on your Women in Wind Power List entry and your nomination for the Green Business Leaders Entrepreneur of the Year Award. I hope you win. But not everyone's. You don't have to be necessarily particularly committed to climate change to invest in this. Is it actually a good investment? So if somebody's thinking, oh, I've got a whole portfolio, shall I invest in your wind farm?
Well, so I mean, the vast majority of our members are doing it primarily for climate change, and Ripple isn't an investment vehicle. So people they join the co-op in order to get the low-cost green electricity that the wind farm generates. However, if you looked at it on a sort of, you know, IRR basis, it's, you know, obviously there are risks about electricity prices and wind output over the years. Exactly. But yeah, I mean, it's people will. Well, we expect over the lifetime of the wind farm, people's savings will be significantly more than their upfront costs. So yeah, it makes sense. You'll save money on your electricity bill over the long term, and you get stable electricity prices. So, you know, if you're on a green tariff, if the wholesale electricity price goes up, so does your bill. With Ripple, the cost of operating the wind farm doesn't increase with the market electricity price, so you get that stability of cost. But yeah, so it is. Yeah, I don't know of any of our members who don't believe in climate change. They want to, you know, they're getting involved with Ripple because they want to make a real, genuine, really tangible difference. So yeah, but yeah, if there was somebody who was looking at it just on the financials, then yeah,
it's going to be it's an investment worth doing.
It stacks up. Yeah.
And just finally, turning to our council leaderships. Are there any additional powers that councils need to do a better job of this? I know David mentioned early on that there were really strong incentives in the early days around solar, which are not so good, but the costs have come down. Well, what other powers might you like from government to make this whole world easier?
Well, the two things the LGA's been lobbying for, Vicky, and I think this is absolutely right, is that the government work with local authorities and agree a strategic plan for how we're going to do this over the next 30 years. And then that needs to be backed up with certainty around funding sources. You know, there are some things the private sector is going to be able to deliver, and we want to encourage them to get on and do that. But there are other things that local councils are going to have to do. You know, on-street parking strikes me as one of those in areas that are already built. So, yeah, strategic plan and long-term funding from government is what we're lobbying for and what we need, I think.
Lorna or Nicola?
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I mean, the recent Power Shift report from UK 100 really scoped that very well in terms of the things that we need to do, and the long-term planning and the certainty of resources are absolutely at the heart of that. I think for us in a rural area, there is particularly an issue about retrofits of domestic housing, private domestic housing, as well as housing association properties, and the ability to do that in a rural area is quite a challenge, and we'll need significant resourcing behind it to make it work.
Nicola, and then I'm just going to give the final word to Dan.
Yeah, the only to add to what David and Lorna said, I think this government, I mean, notwithstanding Brexit and COVID, I think there's a real reckoning that needs to happen about devolution generally. You know, it's kind of become a bit of an Osborne micro project that feels like now in 2021, the government need to get their heads around future devolution for cities and, well, on all regions actually. And I feel like we as local authorities, regardless, to be honest, whether or not they're in a metro area or not, should be pushing really hard for clarity around kind of how regions will function with some autonomy in future, as we kind of understand the finance picture in particular around this, because we do need to strike that balance between autonomy and also sort of central government direction.
Dan, I'm going to give you the final word before we close.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, really just banging the drum of what I said in my kind of 5-minute intro, really, that it's not a powers issue, but just the local authorities and local planning authorities in particular have a bit more resourcing to actually do more community engagement work with communities to enable, you know, this massive rollout of renewables from where we are. Because it's a step change we need.
It's not
basically.
powers, it's empowerment.
It's empowerment and the resources to fund it.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. I think this has been a really interesting debate. I know councils, communities and individuals will have benefited from this, and we'll make sure it goes onto our YouTube channel. Well done to everyone who's with your great work already, and good luck to Sarah in the awards coming up. And I look forward to hearing much more about everything that's going on in your areas. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.